July 15th, 1976. Chowchilla, California. A quiet school bus hums down a dusty road carrying 26 children and their driver back from a summer swimming trip. There's laughter, chatter, and the smell of sunscreen in the air. But within minutes, everything goes silent. A van pulls in front of the bus and stops. 3 masked men step out, armed, calm, and chillingly prepared. The driver has no chance to escape. The children are too stunned to scream. One by one, they are herded into the back of a darkened van. No one knows where they're being taken, and no one hears from them for the next 16 hours. When police arrive at the scene, all they find is an empty school bus parked in a dry riverbed. No signs of a struggle, no clues, no witnesses. It's as if 27 souls simply vanished off the face of the earth. But this wasn't just a kidnapping. These children were buried alive, deep underground, inside a metal tomb. And what's even more disturbing, the men who did it weren't career criminals. They were the sons of millionaires. In this video, we're diving deep into one of the most horrifying mass kidnappings in American history, the Chowchilla bus kidnapping. By the end, you'll uncover not only how these children survived the unthinkable, but also the twisted truth behind the men who buried them alive and walked away smiling. Chowchilla was the kind of town where people didn't lock their doors at night. Nestled in California's Central Valley, it was surrounded by farmland, small churches, and quiet neighborhoods where everyone knew everyone. Violent crime was rare. Danger felt distant, like something that only happened in big cities, not here. The children on that bus were between 5 and 14 years old. They had just spent the afternoon at the local community pool, splashing, laughing, exhausted in the best way possible. It was summer vacation, and life was simple. Behind the wheel was 55-year-old Edward Ray, known to the kids as Ed. He was quiet, dependable, and had been driving the same route for years. To the parents of Chowchilla, Ed was more than a bus driver. He was a guardian, a man who would never let anything bad happen to their children. At 4 p.m., Ed turned the bus onto a rural road, heading back to the children's drop-off points. It was the final leg of a normal, sunny day. But as they rounded a bend near Avenue 21, Ed spotted something strange. A white van was parked in the middle of the road, blocking the way. He slowed down, thinking maybe the vehicle had broken down, but as he got closer, the van didn't move. And then 2 men in ski masks stepped into the road, guns drawn. At first, Ed thought it was a joke, a prank maybe, but then he saw the third man, also masked, standing beside the van, holding restraints. Within seconds, the reality snapped into place. This wasn't a prank, it was a hijacking, and Chowchilla was about to lose its innocence forever. Ed Ray slammed the brakes. Dust kicked up around the tires as the bus came to a stop. The children were confused at first. Some thought it was a surprise drill. Others giggled nervously, waiting for someone to explain. But Ed's face said it all. He stood slowly, arms raised, and stepped off the bus. That's when the men stormed in. 3 of them. Faces hidden behind nylon masks, shotguns and handguns in hand. No words, no yelling, just calm, calculated movements. Like they'd rehearsed this moment over and over. They ordered Ed back on the bus and forced him to sit beside the children. The leader scanned the seats slowly as if taking inventory. One child later recalled that his hands didn't even shake. One by one, the children were forced off the bus. Each was marched into a second vehicle, a dark, windowless van waiting nearby. As the last child was shoved inside, the heavy doors slammed shut. Darkness swallowed them. Inside, it was suffocating, hot, crowded. The windows were covered. The floor was lined with makeshift padding to muffle sound. The children could barely breathe, let alone scream. For hours, the vans drove in silence. No one knew where they were headed. Some of the younger children cried for their parents. Others just sat frozen. Ed tried to comfort them, offering whatever calm he could, but he was just as scared. After what felt like forever, the van stopped. The captors opened the doors. Blinding light flooded in, but only for a moment. What happened next would haunt these children forever. They were led out of the vans, not into freedom, but into something far worse. A hole in the ground. A massive dark cavity carved into a rock quarry. At the bottom, a buried moving truck disguised as a tomb. One by one, the kidnappers forced the children and Ed Ray down a ladder, into the dark. Then they sealed the entrance and left them there, to die. The air inside the buried truck was thick, heavy. Every breath felt like breathing through cloth soaked in dust. The space was about 8 feet high and 16 feet long, just enough to fit the 26 children and Edray if they stayed close. The walls were made of steel, reinforced with wooden beams and covered in mattresses. The kidnappers had tried to make it comfortable, as if that made it less monstrous. There was no light, just the soft whimpering of children and the occasional thud of someone bumping into the metal walls. The only thing that separated them from the outside world was a manhole-sized hatch at the top, now sealed with 1,000-pound industrial batteries, planks, and dirt. For the first few minutes, the children sat in stunned silence. They didn't cry, didn't scream, they just waited, hoping someone would come, hoping it was all a mistake. Then time started to crawl. The kidnappers had left a small supply of food, peanut butter, cereal, bread, and jugs of water. But the air was stale and heat began to build. There was no ventilation, no fresh oxygen. Every breath they took pulled more CO2 into the air. Some of the children began to vomit, others fainted. The smallest ones began to cry uncontrollably. Panic spread like fire. Edray, still dazed but determined, tried to keep everyone calm. He sang songs with the children, told stories. He reminded them that they had to stay awake, stay alert, because someone would find them. Someone had to. But hours passed and no one came. They were buried alive, 12 feet underground, in the dark, with no idea if rescue was even possible. The fear began to shift. It wasn't just fear of the kidnappers anymore. It was fear of dying down there, slowly, forgotten. And then, just when it felt like they might give in, something changed. Edray stood up, looked around, and said 5 words that would change everything. "We're going to get out." Edray had made up his mind. They weren't going to wait to be rescued. They were going to claw their way out. Using nothing but sheer determination, teamwork, and their bare hands, Ed and the older boys began tearing at the wooden beams supporting the metal roof. Every crack of wood felt like thunder in that silent tomb. They didn't know what was above them, just that somewhere beyond the metal, the dirt and the weight of the world, there was air, there was life. But it wouldn't be easy. Above them sat heavy steel plates, battery frames, and packed soil. It was over 1,000 pounds of dead weight pressing down on a steel hatch. And that hatch, locked shut from the outside, was their only way out. As they pulled apart the insulation and wood, the ceiling began to shift. Dust poured down. At one point, a wooden beam cracked, and for a moment they feared the roof would collapse. Some of the kids screamed, others prayed. One boy whispered to himself over and over, "Please, just let us see the sky." Still, they kept digging. 16 hours after the nightmare began, a crack of light pierced through the ceiling. Then, fresh air. With the last of their strength, Ed and 2 of the oldest boys, Mike and Jeff, managed to push the hatch just enough to wedge it open. They scrambled to the surface, covered in dirt and sweat, emerging from the ground like ghosts. They flagged down a nearby worker at the quarry. He stared in shock. These weren't just kids. They were survivors. Within hours, police arrived. One by one, the children were pulled from the tomb. Most were dehydrated, shaking, traumatized, but alive. They had escaped what should have been their grave, and they did it themselves. Across the country, the headlines exploded. 26 children found after mass kidnapping, buried alive and lived to tell the tale. The town of Chowchilla wept with joy. Parents collapsed in tears as their children were returned to them. The bus driver, Ed Ray, was hailed as a hero. But one question echoed louder than any other. Who would do something like this? The search for the culprits behind the Chowchilla kidnapping kicked into overdrive. The FBI, local police, and even the California Highway Patrol launched a massive investigation. Tips flooded in. Sketches were drawn, roadblocks set up. But the biggest clue didn't come from a lead. It came from a mistake. The kidnappers had tried to cover their tracks, but they left behind something critical. The vans. Abandoned in the quarry, the vehicles used to transport the children were traced back to a rental company. It didn't take long to track the paperwork, and what they found sent chills through the investigators. The vans were registered under false names, but the signature matched a very real person, Frederick Newhall Woods IV. Woods wasn't a hardened criminal or an escaped convict. He was a 24-year-old son of a wealthy family, born into luxury, privilege, and trust funds, and he wasn't alone. His two accomplices? Richard and James Schoenfeld. Also young, also from millionaire families, also raised in gated mansions, not prison cells. They weren't desperate. They weren't starving. They weren't out for revenge. They did it for money. Their plan was simple and sick. They intended to demand a $5 million ransom for the children's release. That's why they buried them. They thought they could keep the kids alive just long enough to collect the cash and vanish. But their plan backfired when the phone lines at the police station were so flooded with calls from the press and frantic parents, they couldn't even get their ransom demand through. By the time they regrouped, the children had already escaped. The public was outraged. These weren't monsters from the shadows. They were rich kids with trust funds and college degrees who decided to bury children alive for profit. The Schoenfeld brothers turned themselves in. Woods was caught 2 weeks later, hiding in a mansion in Canada, and the world wanted justice. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled every seat. Parents sat clutching tissues. Survivors, now dressed in clean clothes but still haunted, whispered anxiously in the gallery. The whole country was watching. Frederick Woods and the Schoenfeld brothers were each charged with 27 counts of kidnapping and robbery, one for every child, plus Ed Ray. At trial, their defense was as cold as their crime. They admitted to the kidnapping, but insisted they never meant to hurt anyone. The public wasn't buying it. The prosecutors painted a picture of calculated greed. They showed blueprints of the underground tomb, lists of food items, equipment receipts. The plan had been months in the making. This wasn't a last-minute decision. It was a blueprint for terror. The most chilling moment? When a child survivor took the stand. Voice trembling, she said, "I thought we were going to die. I thought they were going to bury us forever." That testimony broke something in the room. In 1977, all three men were found guilty. The judge, his voice shaking with emotion, sentenced them each to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Or so it seemed. Because over the years, the story didn't end. James Schoenfeld was paroled in 2015, Richard followed in 2012, and Frederick Woods, the mastermind, was released in 2022 after serving over 45 years. His parole sparked national outrage. Survivors, now in their 50s and 60s, wrote letters, gave interviews, pleaded with the courts to keep him locked away. But it wasn't enough. The justice system had changed, and so the man who once buried children alive walked free into a world he tried to ransom. They survived the unthinkable, but survival came at a cost. In the years that followed the kidnapping, many of the 26 children of Chowchilla tried to return to normal life. But how do you go back to math tests and birthday parties after being buried alive? The trauma ran deep. Some had night terrors that never stopped. Others battled anxiety, depression, and addiction. Many couldn't sleep without a light on, even decades later. Several of the children, now adults, said they never felt safe again. One survivor admitted he dug escape routes under his own house, just in case. Another couldn't stay in small spaces, couldn't get on buses, couldn't trust the dark. And Ed Ray, the quiet bus driver who kept them calm in the tomb, was honored as a hero. But even he struggled. He once told a reporter he had nightmares until the day he died. In 2016, the survivors were awarded a civil settlement from the kidnappers' trust funds. But no amount of money could erase what happened, because the real damage wasn't physical, it was the invisible kind. The kind that lingers, the kind that grows up with you, the kind that never lets go. Today, many of the Chowchilla survivors have shared their stories publicly, not for fame, but for healing, to show the world that they weren't just victims. They were fighters. They were children who escaped the grave. If this case shook you as much as it shook the world, tell us in the comments. What would you have done if you were in that bus? We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you found this story gripping, make sure to subscribe. We uncover real crimes that will keep you on edge every single week.